So in our next section, we're going to talk about both OSPF version 2 and OSPF version 3 on regular iOS and XR. And we're going to split OSPF into multiple sections where, in this case, we're going to look at the basic functionality. How do we enable it? How do we verify that it's working? What are some of the troubleshooting things that we would need to think about? And we'll look at later the advanced functionality of OSPF in the core, and then also the advanced functionality of OSPF as the PE to CE routing protocol in the scope of L3 VPN. But in terms of building basic reachability, one of the first things that we want to think about within the service provider core, that if the core of our network is consisting of these 6 routers in the middle, so it's routers 1 through 3 and then XR1 through XR3, our first basic step is that we need to establish IPv4 reachability between all the loopback interfaces of the PE routers. Now, we'll see specifically why that is the case a little bit later when we talk about LDP and we talk about BGP, but essentially the source and destination of MPLS tunnels is generally going to be the loopback 0 interface of the provider edge router. So if I'm not able to ping the loopback, it means I won't be able to establish an LDP adjacency. If I'm not able to ping the loopback, it means that when I actually send labeled traffic over the core, then eventually that traffic could get dropped. Now, we'll see that within the scope of regular iOS, we support both IPv4 and IPv6 routing in OSPF v3 and IPv4 routing in OSPF v2, where in the case of iOS XR, at least in the current releases, they're mutually exclusive. That if you want to do IPv4 routing, you have to run OSPF version 2. OSPF version 3 is just going to be for IPv6. It does not currently have the multi-AF support. So depending on how the questions are formatted in the exam, that's one of the considerations, that basically the protocols are not interoperable with each other. Okay, so let's take a look at this within the scope of the command line. And before we configure any of our basic IP protocols, we want to make sure that we have basic transport between the devices. So starting here between router 1 and XR1, we want to make sure, and let me actually zoom in a little bit here. So between router 1 and XR1 here, we want to make sure that we have just basic IP connectivity. So we have the devices pre-configured with both IPv4 and IPv6 addresses. And in this case, the link between 1 and XR1 is 10.1.11.11 on XR1. And then the IPv6 address is 2001, 10.1.11, 11, I should say, as well. Okay, so this tells us we have basic unicast reachability. And as we know, for OSPF, it uses both the unicast and multicast for transport. So we would also need to make sure that we have IPv4 multicast for 224.0.0.5 and 224.0.0.6. And for IPv6, the equivalent addresses would be FFO2::5 and FFO2::6. Now, since in our cases, we're dealing with point-to-point Ethernet connectivity, typically that's not going to be a design constraint. We will see it may be a potential issue later when we're dealing with either DMVPN as an overlay tunnel or when we're dealing with a virtual private LAN service, whether they do or do not support multicast transport over the L2 VPN. But at least within the scope of the core network, we should generally not have any type of transport problems when we're trying to establish our basic control plane OSPF reachability. Okay, so in the case of router 1, we're going to enable the routing process 2 ways. We're going to go at the link level gig1.111, and we'll say IP OSPF 1 area 0. This is going to be for our OSPF version 2 process. And then also OSPF version 3.1 is going to be running IPv6, and the area is 0. Now, it's important to note here that even though these processes have the same number, OSPF v2 process 1 and OSPF v3 process 1 are independent of each other because they're advertising different address families. OSPF v2 is advertising IPv4, OSPF v3 is advertising IPv6. So when we go to do our verifications, it means we need to use 2 different formats of syntax. We need to say show IP OSPF interface brief and show IP OSPF neighbors, and show OSPF v3 interface brief and show OSPF v3